Please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. We are studying 1 Corinthians as this is Bible Bowl material for lads to leaders. It's a good study for us, but it helps to emphasize to them these chapters in 1 Corinthians. So that's our Sunday night studies quite often. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Now, if we were going to say, what's it about? Well, I've got this little heading that says, the ministry of apostles. And of course, while it is apostles in general, then there's some things said about Paul himself specifically. If we were going to summarize what is said about Paul, you might use the three words, servant, steward, and sacrifice. And those three words would well account for Paul, the apostle, in this chapter. Going to read a paragraph and then go back and kind of discuss some things from those sections. First, we'll read verses 1 through 5. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I am not aware of anything against me, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. In that first verse are three very important words. You have the words servants, stewards, and mysteries. Now the first two would apply towards Paul or the apostles in general. But that word servant, well, there's several Greek words translated servant. In fact, in chapter 3, verse 5 was that word servant, translated from diakonos, which carried the idea of a table waiter. An humble man certainly doing his work and task. But this word is not the same. Still servant in English, but a different word in Greek. And the origin of that word has to do with an under-rower. Now somebody might think, what's an under-rower? Well, you've seen the old movies or the pictures, and there'd be this boat, somewhat massive, but oars going out the side of the boat. And there in the belly of the ship would be these men rowing. And if it was in a movie, or if it was a picture, you're probably able to see almost the sweat gleaming from their body because it was a hard, hot job. And you probably see their muscles straining because as they have done this, they've built up their muscles and they've become some mighty men. But a glamorous job? Not at all. A hard one, yes. And kind of, oh, by the way, Paul and the apostles are considered servants, under rowers. Hard, not glamorous. Difficult. Truly a work of a servant, many times the slaves. Someone might say, wait. Preacher, this is about Paul. What's this got to do with me? Verse 16. He says, you be followers of me. Now that might be a challenge for us to say, follow me. But Paul says here, and also 1 Corinthians 11, follow me. Now there he says, follow me as I also follow Christ. So as I read about him as he is the servant of Christ, I think, I need to be the servant of Christ. I need to be the under-rower, if you would. The next word is stewards. Now, stewards, a little bit more grandiose of a word. It was used in the Hellenistic period of a person who would be in charge of an estate belonging to an absentee landlord. So no, he didn't own it. but he was overseeing. He was watching over. He was in a place of somewhat position. He may have been even a servant or slave, but in a place of position. But he was not the owner. But see now in this particular instance, and stewards of the mysteries of God. He's the servant of Christ and a steward of the mysteries of God. Mysteries. Well, that word is found in 1 Corinthians in chapter 2, verse 7, here in chapter 4, verse 1, and chapter 13, verse 2, and chapter 14, verse 2, and chapter 15, verse 51. So it's not unusual to read it in 1 Corinthians. If someone were going to say, but mysteries, what does he mean by mysteries? Well, just think about the word mystery generally. Sometimes maybe translated by the word secret. But the idea is something concealed, then later revealed. You read a mystery novel, all through it, it's kind of like, what's happening? Who did it? And then you get to the end and it's revealed and you know the answer. But more specifically, this mysteries of God, it was applied towards the gospel of Jesus Christ, and in a very specific way to the fact of the Jew and Gentile, both saved by the gospel of Jesus Christ and populating the one church that Jesus built. You can read about this in Ephesians 3:6 and Colossians 1:24 to 28. We're not going to spend any more time on that because back a couple of chapters ago we made mention of those verses and we read them. Think about mystery. Think about the gospel. But in a specific way too, gospels to Jew and Gentile. And then both populate the one church. But he's a steward. He's got responsibility of it and over it. By the way, steward is not a word that I use a lot in my everyday vocabulary. And I know growing up, when I heard the word stewardship, it almost was used entirely with regards to giving. And that's okay in this regards. Steward, one responsible or overseeing. Well, God's given you and you're responsible and overseeing the material, physical blessings, and so your giving comes out of your stewardship. With V.P. Black, Becky's dad, has done extraordinary amount of preaching in his lifetime on stewardship and giving. Wrote books on the subject, and I think that it'd be impossible to know the good that he did in preaching on the subject. Well, he mentioned that 4 things were consistent of stewardship. One was divine ownership. That is, that God owns it all. The idea that God created it means He owns it. And the second was human endowment. He owns it, and then He's entrusted us, given to us. And then third was faithful administration. We're going to see a little bit something about that in the next verse. And then last, inevitable accounting. I think that kind of how could you better summarize stewardship by those 4 terms? And Paul, he's a steward of the mysteries of God. Just kind of to give you an idea, a little bit more of stewards of the mysteries of God. I want to read from a couple of passages. 1 Timothy 1:11 and 12. 1 Timothy 1:11 and 12, it says, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God, which I have been entrusted. Get that? The gospel, which I have been entrusted. I thank Him who has given me strength, Christ Jesus our Lord, because He judged me faithful, appointing me in His service. He describes here how he was that steward. Then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, he says, "For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved of God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but to please God who tests our hearts." So there's a couple other passages where Paul speaks of being entrusted with the gospel, and so he speaks. Once again, somebody might say, "I'm not Paul and I'm not an apostle." But he said, "You follow me." And isn't there a sense in which we, understanding and knowing the gospel, have been entrusted with it and should speak it? Then verse 2, "Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful." You know, the third thing Brother Black said was a part of stewardship was faithful administration. You see, there's a reason to be faithful as well. It's because there is going to be an inevitable accounting. And we're going to see that this idea is present kind of beyond. Look at verse 3. "But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court." So many times we spend too much time thinking, what they going to think about me? What they going to think about my dress? Or what they going to think about my purse? Or what they going to think about, I'm a man, I've got a pink shirt on. You know, how many times we worry about what somebody else going to think? Seriously now. And yet he says, it's a small thing that I should be judged by you. Or even by a human court. Then he goes on to say, in fact, I do not even judge myself. Now we are to examine ourselves, 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. But here he's saying, I don't even judge myself. Now if we were to say, why not? Look at verse 4. "For I am not aware of anything against myself." In other words, if I'm going to judge me, I'm going to judge me pretty good. Years ago, many years ago, could call it ancient history, and it would be the original Jack Exum, because I think there was a junior and a third and etc. But he would preach a sermon and he'd talk about, your dirt's dirtier than mine. You know what he meant by that? About how that we are hard on others and their sin, and we kind of gloss over our own. Your dirt's dirtier than mine. Well, Paul says, you better be careful even about judging yourself. And then he concludes, it is the Lord who judges me. It is the Lord who judges me. This is what we need to get in our hearts and our minds. It's not so much what other people think, not even a human court. And it's not even so much what I think, but what does the Lord think of it? If all my aim and ambition is to please somebody, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. If all my aim and ambition is to be pleasing to a court, well, what if the laws are against God? If all my ambition is to have a clear conscience, and that's it, I judge myself, still dangerous. But if my goal is to please God, if that's really my goal, I want to please God, everything's going to be okay. I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to tell it. Somebody I heard it from, I can't verify it. I don't even know who said it. I actually Googled it and thought it'd be really rare that I can find this, Googling it. But I was told that somebody called Brother Gus Nichols one time on the phone. And of course, as he's been dead many years, this would have had to have been very, very many years ago. How you doing, Brother Nichols? I'm doing as I please. Sounds like a strange thing for him to have said. And then he followed it up, because I'm trying to do as the Lord pleases. You know what? If seriously, if what pleases me is to please the Lord, it's going to turn out okay, isn't it? And so Paul says, I'm just the servant of Christ. But now he has entrusted me as a steward of the gospel, the mysteries. But I want to tell you right now, you Corinthians, I'm not doing this to please you. You're not going to be judging me. Not even the courts of men. I'm not even judging myself. But you know what? I'm going to stand accountable before God. Oh, by the way, giving and standing account before God. Look at verse 5. Therefore do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes. Now look at these words. Who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purposes of the heart. You know, we may think, nobody knows. I've hidden it pretty good. And I can't stand that phrase, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You know what the implication really is? You misbehave there and nobody knows back home. God knows. No secret. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13, getting to the end of the chapter, he says, let us then, he says, and no creature is hidden from his sight. You know what that's saying? God sees all. But all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. So God knows it. You're not hiding from God. But it's not even what you do. He says, we'll disclose the purposes of the heart. He knows what we're thinking even. Now let's look at verses 6 through 8. He says, I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? If then you received it, why did you boast as if you did not receive it? Now, if I were in a Bible study with somebody about authority matters, I'd like to make mention of this verse, verse 6, not to go beyond what is written. But what I'd like for you to see, it's a little more interesting in a sense. Verse 6, about 4/5 the way through it, the words puffed up. Puffed up. Sometimes I eat a good meal, I feel puffed up afterwards. No, that's not what he's talking about. In fact, the word is translated oftentimes, in other translations, arrogant. In the English Standard, sometimes it's puffed up, sometimes it's arrogant. And it's found here in chapter 4. It's also in verses 18 and 19, and in chapter 5, verse 2, chapter 8, verse 1, chapter 13, verse 4. And oh, by the way, it's not good to be puffed up. or to be arrogant. And he says that none of you be puffed up. Watch out for an arrogant spirit. Watch out. Now verse 8, beginning in verse 8 reading. He says, already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Without us you have become kings. And would that you did reign, so that we might share the rule with you. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. We are held in honor, but we in disrepute. To the present hour we hunger and thirst, we are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor working with our own hands. When reviled we bless, when persecuted we endure, when slandered we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. Now, I hope that you would notice in reading this that there's a contrast between you, the Corinthians, and then Paul and the apostles. And quite a bit of a contrast. And it's almost like this way. Look how they view themselves. He says, already you have all you want. Now, the King James Version has the word full. But the idea of full here is just like you've eaten a meal and then you are full. You're satisfied. You don't want any more. You know, the only joke I remember my grandfather telling was about being full. He said that there was this old country boy man who couldn't hear very well, and then there was this a very sophisticated lady, and both were widowers, and so he went on a date with her and took her to a nice place to eat, and he always liked to see people eat aplenty, and he says, and she said, I have eaten sufficiently. And said it real fancy like, he can't hear to you. He says, I say you went fishing. And then he says, she's kind of frustrated, not knowing what to say, and she says, I've had plenty. Say you caught 20. And then she's just real frustrated. She pushes her plate. She says, I don't want no more. He says, you broke your pole. Well, you are to the point sometimes where you're full, you're satisfied. That's the point here is hey, we have all we want. Become rich, have become kings. And over in verse 10, you're wise in Christ. You're strong. You're held in honor. Could this be a little bit of puffed up arrogance on their part? And as I mentioned, then contrasted with Paul and the apostles. He says over in verse 9, I thank God has exhibited us apostles. An exhibit. Think of going to a museum, and there it's for everybody to see. He's shown us to be, look, last of all. Men sentenced to death. Okay, the apostles, how'd they die? And you might say, well, my Bible doesn't tell me how every apostle dies, and that's true. But when you take the Bible and secular history, you come up with every apostle, except for John, died a martyr's death. Like men sentenced to death. And says we become a spectacle to the world. This is that word for theater, and actually used within the context may have made the Romans think of that place literally where men would gather to watch others fight to the death. He says we're a spectacle to to the world, to angels, to men. We are fools for Christ. He says, you're held in honor. We're in disrepute. Then some of the suffering. Look at verse 11. We hunger, we thirst, poorly dressed, buffeted, homeless, labor, working with our own hands, reviled, persecuted, slandered. This, along with 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 28, are probably the best places to go to read of sufferings of Paul, and in this place, and of the apostles. Then he goes on to say, and still, like the scum of the world. New King James Version says filth. And then the refuse. New King James Version says off-scouring. And somebody might say, what do you mean here? And what I read, it was almost like, you know how you've maybe there's a surface and it's got, you've been messy at the meal and there's little bits of food on the table. Or maybe you're going to use the table and it's just been sitting there a long time and it's got dust and dirt. And so you wipe it off, and maybe even then you even cup your hand to wipe it into your hand, or you put a trash can there. That's kind of what he's describing himself here when he says refuse or off-scouring. That trash that you would just sweep away. That's what they were to the world. And that's how they were considered by so many. You know what it said about, Paul and the apostles? Mentioned 3 words: service, stewardship, and sacrifice. And doesn't this well describe their sacrifice? Now, verse 14, I do not write these things to make you ashamed. They ought to feel that way. I mean, when he describes them as being puffed up, and then they have an attitude like, I'm full, I've got all I want, I'm rich, we're kings, we're wise, we're strong, we're held in honor. He says, I'm writing to admonish you, to warn them. Verse 15, though you have countless guides. Now, the King James Version, other translations say 10,000. If you were to look this word up in Thayer, you're going to see the word 10,000s or countless. Kind of either way. And basically what it is it's an exaggeration. It's the figure of speech, hyperbole, is used. Did they really have 10,000 guides or guardians or instructors? No, not literally. If I've told you this once, I've told you 1,000 times. Okay, maybe you didn't really say it 1,000 times. We understand hyperbole. He's using that here. If someone were going to say, what do you think is some key words this whole chapter? Verse 16, I urge you then, be imitators of me. As I said, this is about Paul and the apostles. So what bearing is that for the Corinthians? What bearing on that is for you? For me, sorry about that. Nobody's sleeping now, though. If they imitate him, if we would imitate him, and that's why I think those 3 words, imitators of me, some of the most important words in the chapter. Would we be imitators of Paul? Would we be a servant, a steward? Would we be sacrificial? If we could assist you in your obedience tonight, either to the gospel of Jesus Christ in baptism, or if there's need for prayer, won't you come as